We'll now move on to our second speaker on opposition, Dr. Remi Adekoya. Remi Adekoya teaches politics at the University of York. He's also a writer and political scientist interested in identity and African development. He's written for The Guardian, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, The Spectator, and other publications. And he's also the author of the upcoming book, Biracial Britain, A Different Way of Looking at Race, which explores race and identity from a mixed race perspective. Remi, the floor is yours.
Absolutely lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor. However, for a start, I would like to take some issue with the underlying premise behind the motion of this debate, namely that this House would stop talking and start listening on race. Now, this House symbolizes certainly Cambridge University as a whole, and arguably Britain as a nation. People of color are present in both Cambridge University as well as wider Britain and must never be silenced in either. Yet the implicit suggestion behind today's proposition is that this House somehow consists solely of a white we, trying to figure out how to interact with the black and brown they amidst the current focus on race in Britain and other parts of the world. This presumption in itself could be deemed a little, well, racist, or at the very least, exclusivist. So I just wanted to note that. But okay, let's get back to the issue of who should talk about race in Britain and how. My views on race essentially are shaped by my family background and upbringing. I'm the son of a Nigerian father and Polish mother. It's no exaggeration to say my parents grew up in different cultural universes. My father was raised in British-ruled colonial Nigeria. My mother grew up in communist Poland. My parents' very different upbringings shaped them into people with significantly divergent cultural worldviews. And the racial differences that appear to divide us so often are de facto at heart often cultural differences. So for instance, my father, who was brought up in the honor culture that characterizes his ethnic group, the Yorubas, was very big on respect. It was extremely important to him that he be addressed respectfully, perhaps even deferentially, in public especially, including by my mother, his wife. Not because my father was a particularly dictatorial type, but because he feared being judged a weak man by the society around him. And the dominant norms of that society stipulated that a man who wasn't addressed respectfully in public by his wife was a weak man and not really worthy of respect. My father, who was an introvert, never really explained this cultural expectation of manhood to my mom. Instead, he'd get upset when at social gatherings, my mom, who was a very opinionated person, would challenge my father's political views or worldviews in front of his friends and in front of other people. I remember many silent car rides on the way back home spent in stony silence, coming back from one social gathering or the other. So one day I asked my dad why he didn't mind my mom criticizing his ideas at home, but seemed to get very upset when she'd do it publicly. So my dad explained to me how Yoruba culture works on that end and said it's because he knew people would view him negatively, might view him as being a weak man. I then explained this to my mom. And she said, "Why didn't your dad just tell me this?" She was surprised. I said, "Well, Mom, because you never asked him why he was reacting the way he was reacting." And from that day on, my mom either praised my dad's ideas in front of his friends or at the very least desisted from criticizing them. But once they got home, she'd lay into him and tell him how rubbish she thought this or that idea which he'd mentioned that evening had been, or how ridiculous she thought this or that argument which he'd put forward that evening had been. And my dad would roar with laughter, actually, because in truth, he actually enjoyed my mom slaying his ideas as long as she didn't do this publicly. So this issue that had caused so many arguments with them disappeared because my mom now understood where my dad was coming from. From then on, my parents listened to each other more carefully. And for this, to make it clear, it wasn't just from my mom's side. Because my dad saw my mom listening to him more carefully, paying more attention to his cultural sensibilities, my dad also started doing the same. And honestly speaking, I felt like a 16-year-old marriage counselor at the time. I'm not saying my parents' marriage became perfect afterwards, but I do think it became happier because every relationship is a conversation. And for a conversation to provide mutual satisfaction, both sides need to speak and listen in order to understand each other better. If you do all the speaking and I only listen, then you'll never get to know what I'm thinking. Same goes the other way around. And I want you to know what I'm thinking and why, and I want to know what you are thinking and why. Dialogue is the foundation of community, and the community that is Britain is and can be no different. Now, I know there's some people of color in Britain who say, well, hang on a minute, that's all fine and well, but for centuries we were enslaved, colonized, oppressed, and silenced. Despite us supposedly always being part of the British Empire and later a Commonwealth, up until recent decades, there were hardly any black or brown people on TV, and those who were got cast in stereotypical roles, the black criminal, the Indian shopkeeper, the Pakistani with the funny accent. If you were a writer of color, and this unfortunately sometimes is still the case today, you might propose a pitch for a book and hear from publishers that while your pitch sounds interesting, something similar has already been written. Similar how? Well, another writer of color recently wrote a book on a similar topic. Now, the implication being, why would anyone be interested in another book on a similar topic by another writer of color? As if there's not an endless stream of books on identical themes constantly emerging from white writers. Now, the message people of color can take from these experiences is, yes, we're interested in listening to your stories, but in small doses, please, and preferably rarely. These kinds of experiences are, of course, arguably mild phenomena compared to the open racial abuse and condescension Black and brown people in this country still deal with. In a June 2020 YouGov poll, for instance, 64% of BAME respondents reported having experienced a racial slur said to them directly. Half say this has happened on 2 or more occasions. June 2020. Now, all this can lead to the development of feelings that right now, it is time for the other side to shut up and start listening to us. It's time the other side heard our pain, not just once or twice, so they can take a have listened box and move on, but as many times as that pain is felt. And I understand why some people of color might feel this way. But just because white people refuse to listen to us for centuries doesn't mean we have to behave the same way now, just because of the fact that the moral atmosphere of present affords us that opportunity. The best thing we as people of color could do today is treat white people as we wish we had been treated all those years, as equal partners in this dialogue called society, not because we are silly or because we are suckers, but because we know the worst thing we could do would be to imitate the behaviors of those we have rightly criticized, just because we might be temporarily, or we'll see for how long, in a position of advantage. But what kind of advantage are you talking about, some might ask? Talking about minorities, of course, might ask. We are the minority here. There's way more of them than there is of us, and they control all the power structures in this country. Yes, that is true, but there is such a thing as having the moral advantage. And we should not pretend we have not had that in recent months following the horrible killing of George Floyd, especially with regards to those of us of Black descent. We do enjoy a moral high ground at the moment, and we shouldn't pretend there's no power at all that comes with that. So the question actually is, how will we use that moral power we have now? Will we use it to try and gain revenge on our white neighbors for all the ills they may or may not personally have committed towards us? Will we use it by deploying our moral high ground to say, now it's our turn to speak while you must simply listen? Or do we show them how this dialogue thing should always have worked? Give and take, listen and speak, mutual respect, mutual compassion, no winners or losers. Isn't this the best way to show all those who have underrated us for so long how silly a stance that has always been? And that they, Britain as a whole, and the rest of the world have a lot to learn from us about dialogue, about hope, and about community. I say this is the best way forward. This is my position. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Remy. We'll now move